I'm not entirely sure what we're allowed to say. We don't want this video to be taken down from YouTube. There's still a risk of that these days.
That's my official identity. I'm a transgender black lesbian.
There would be guys who can take the job and the career, the professional career in sport of a woman.
There are rights that need to be protected, and I'm going to stand true to that.
I often think about how insane things were 6-7 years ago.
The doors were really open in trying to entertain any and every policy.
Where do you think things lie in relation to the trans question?
The real story here is, there's no benefit to these things. The activists are bending your ear on it. We really should be blocking that false narrative instead of feeding it.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Fiona McAnena. Fiona, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brendan.
It's great to have you back on. People will be familiar with your work as Director of Campaigns at Sex Matters, the heroic Sex Matters, wonderful organisation fighting for women's rights and sanity in our world. You also have a lot of expertise in the sporting arena when it comes to men versus women. And that's one of the things I want to ask you about today. And I guess I want to kick off with the basketball question, because American basketball, which is not normally a sport that us Brits tend to follow, but it is in the news, primarily because a couple of men have quite bravely, I think, or certainly very interestingly, offered to play in the Women's Basketball League as a way of taking the piss out of the trans stuff.
Royce, what are you hoping to get out of declaring for the WNBA draft?
I'm just having the time of my life. I'm living in my feminine era. I'm definitely going through a glow up, and I can't believe all the hate I've received. That's probably the most shocking thing, is the hate that I've received in the first 72 to 100 or so hours of my trans existence, my public trans existence.
Tell us a little bit about what's happened in relation to basketball.
Well, the first thing that happened that drew the world's attention to basketball, women's basketball, was Sophie Cunningham of a team called Indiana Fever, who dared to say something about this. And when she was challenged in an interview, she defended her position and said, "I'm not anti anyone. There's no hate here. I just think that we need a women's category, or else we wouldn't have a job in basketball."
I said what I said. I think it's kind of common sense. When it comes just to protecting young girls in sport and women in sport, I feel very strongly about that.
The average height of a professional basketball player in the US is, if you're a man, 6'10", I think, 6'9", and if you're a woman, 6 foot. So you got to be tall. Most of us can never be professional basketball players, but a tall woman is never going to make it if tall men can also join in. So Sophie Cunningham got lots of criticism for that from all the usual suspects, but she also got a lot of support. And now what's happened is that 2 retired male pro players, who are, of course, giant, 6'8" and 6'10", have said they're going to declare that they're now eligible for the draft. So they're saying, you can recruit me to women's basketball. That's a thing that happens once a year in the spring. And people are saying, don't be ridiculous, you're not really trans. And they're saying, well, I meet the requirements. The rules say I just have to identify as a woman. So what are you going to do about it? So everyone's kind of outraged that they are, or rather the pro-trans people are outraged that they are, as you say, taking the piss. Everyone else is saying, well, yeah, we know they're not serious about this, but this is the problem. Please fix it. And the WNBA have said that they are looking at their guidelines because, frankly, this is humiliating for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to get a sense from you about what those guidelines consist of. I mean, is it, as those 2 retired pro basketball players have said, is it so simple that you just simply need to identify as a woman in order to play in the Women's Basketball Association? I mean, from the kind of videos they made saying, look, we're offering ourselves up for the women's game, it sounds as if that's the case. Is that how straightforward it is?
It's very common across North America, in US and Canada, that's all it takes. Because if you fully internalize the idea that, your trans identity is your inner feeling and no one can police how you look or how you present, it's just about how you feel, then it follows that anyone can simply declare. And this, of course, is the problem. So yeah, this is going to be really interesting. One of the things people say is no one would ever do this for the money, or they would never do it artificially. And of course, in one sense, that's right, because basketball players in the US, if you're male, the average salary is $11 million a year. And if you're female, it's 1% of that, $110,000. So of course, these guys aren't doing it for the money. But if you're a really average male basketball player, say you're 6 foot, 6'1", nothing special, no chance of a career in basketball, you can still stroll into the women's league and make a decent salary doing something you enjoy. So the guys are doing a good thing here in pointing this out.
One argument I've heard many times, I'm sure you've heard it as well, is that, look, the idea of fairness in sport is a bit ridiculous because sports people tend to have natural gifts that the rest of us don't have. And basketball is a perfect example of that. As you say, the men in basketball are huge. I mean, many of them are over 7 feet. I saw a statistic recently, something like if you're over 7 foot tall and you're between the ages of 20 and 40 in America, there's a very good chance you're playing in the NBA. It's an extraordinary statistic. And even in the women's game too, as you say, the women who play in the women's game are very tall, 6 foot. Some are even taller than 6 foot. I mean, it goes without saying these women would run rings around people like me. They're taller than me. They're stronger than me. They're more skillful than me. There's no question about that. So people will often say, look, sport is unfair because you're born with certain advantages, whether it be height or strength or whatever else it might be. And that's the nature of sport. So relax, calm down. Don't get so het up about trans women, so-called, playing in women's sports. How do you respond to that argument?
Yeah, so sport is about selecting the best and rewarding the best within a category. And the question is, do you want any categories at all? Well, no one would dispute, for example, that juniors need a separate category from adults. And the difference on average between the male and female, and the difference between the best males and females, and the difference between the worst males and females is vast. So when people talk about, you say that those women would be stronger than you. They wouldn't be stronger than you, but you are quite right to say they would run rings around you because of their skill. But they could not compete in men's basketball. So it's about the difference between individual skill, fitness, strength, and so on, and a category difference. And you cannot train your way out of a category difference. Let me give you one stat. If we look at a sport that is separated by both sex and weight classes, so something like weightlifting or boxing, people say, well, why don't you just match them by size? Well, those sports have done that, but they still need to divide them by sex. And in those sports, if you take a man and a woman of the same weight, the man is lifting roughly 6 weight classes above the woman. So a female weightlifter needs to be 6 weight classes heavier to match what a light weightlifter can do. So you talk, and in boxing, I think it's 8 weight classes. So you're talking about, that's the size of the sex difference when you match for size. So the bottom line is individuals can vary enormously, but the single biggest difference between men and women is so vast that we have to have separate categories for it.
Yeah. And give us a sense of what that might mean in basketball. So to use your example that you said earlier about an average male basketball player can't make the NBA, not tall enough, might just be 6 foot, might even, shock horror, be 5'11", you never know. And he claims to be trans. He might well identify as trans or might just pretend to be trans. To my mind, there's not much difference between those things. But anyway, say a man like that, so he would be a similar height to the female players and he goes into their sport. Even though they would be of similar height, what are the differences we're likely to see if that kind of bloke were to go into the women's game?
Yeah, well, the biggest difference in strength between average male and female bodies is actually upper body strength. Mm. So the ability to throw, he's going to have a huge advantage, even if he's useless, right? Even if he's not very good, he can throw much harder, so he can pass better. It's supposed to be non-contact, but really it's contact, and people can shoulder barge. We've seen a lot of that in football as well. A lot of just tackling where women just get knocked to the ground like they're being, an adult being tackling a child. So he is going to have a physical advantage that will compensate for the skill deficit for the most part. And of course, lots of young men in the US play basketball. So there would be guys who can take the job and the professional career in sport of a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned Sophie Cunningham, who's become global. She's been famous in America for a long time. She's become globally famous after she pointed at an opposing player for a long time. I've shared some of those memes myself. How significant do you think her intervention is? Because, of course, there are women in sport who have been fighting this stuff for a long time. In the US, there's Riley Gaines. In Britain, there's Lynn Pinches in snooker. There's Martina Navratilova. There are Sharon Davis, of course, the heroic Sharon Davis. There are many women who've been speaking out, but it seems that Sophie Cunningham's intervention has caused a particular storm. Do you think it's significant?
Well, I wonder if it's just a question of timing. And, it would be nice to think that we're coming to the point where there is enough cover and enough support that when a player like Sophie Cunningham speaks up, the response is broadly balanced. So there have been some virtue signaling, coaches and players, but there have been plenty of people who've supported her. So I'd like to think it's that. And the problem in the US, of course, is it is so polarized on political lines. But the big shift that happened this year, as you know, Brendan, is the International Olympic Committee finally came to its senses and issued a clear policy statement that says that if you're in a female category, you've got to prove your eligibility, just as you would for anything else. And that means that the LA Olympics in 2028 will be the first to be run since 2000, when sex screening was dropped. They'll be the first to be run where the female competitors can be confident there is no one male taking their place or taking their medals. So maybe this is timing, maybe it's the IOC change, but we're definitely seeing some momentum still back in the direction of sanity and sex-based sport.
Yes, you can really feel that the momentum is shifting a bit. I mean, obviously, you will know more than most. We still have to be on our guard because the insanity that swept our societies over the past 10 years, there's no telling when it might come back. But another step forward, you will have seen the Lawn Tennis Association has banned men from playing in the women's competition. Now, I did want to ask you about this specifically because there are quite a few headlines. I mean, pretty much all the headlines I saw were along the lines of British tennis bans trans women from its sports. Now, obviously, that's just Orwellian in its untruthfulness because they're not banned. They can play in the men's game. They're as free to try out for the men's game as I would be, although I wouldn't do very well. What can we do about that side of it, where even the discussion around this gets blurred because of the way in which language itself has been distorted?
Yeah, well, let's just take a moment to talk about the tennis policy, the Lawn Tennis Association policy, because I think it's a really good example of the steps that organizations seem to go through once they've been really indoctrinated and they find it really hard to let go of, their beliefs about centering trans identifying people. So way back in time, tennis, there was no issue. Men played men's tennis, women played women's tennis. There's lots of mixed tennis and so on. The LTA adopted a policy that said you identify and that's all that matters. And if a woman doesn't like using the changing room with a trans woman, that woman can come changed to play tennis. In other words, the trans identifying man gets priority. After we had better guidance from the Sports Council, still not clear, but clearer, the LTA adopted a two-tier policy. So they said, actually, these sex differences do matter. And coming back to your question about basketball and sex differences, imagine serving in tennis. That is all about upper body strength. Yeah. On average, upper body strength is 35% more in a man compared to a woman. And by the way, the less skilled you are, the bigger the sex differences. So women who train really, really, really hard can a little bit reduce that difference. But of course, it never reduces very far, but it's even more significant at lower levels. So the LTA introduced a policy that said, we do recognize these sex differences. So in top competitions, so, county level and above, you have to be female. But in clubs, all that other stuff, trans women are still women. And what they were effectively saying to, 95, 98% of the women who play tennis in this country is, doesn't matter for you. You're not allowed to care.
Yeah.
So all the people who play club tennis, who want to be the club champion and all of that stuff, doesn't count. The man's feelings count more. So what's just come out is a policy where they have finally understood that that was just crazy and offensive. And they've restored a sex-based policy, but it's riddled with trans activist language. So there's this complicated table that's got transgender women, cisgender women, transgender men, cisgender men, non-binary people assigned female at birth, non-binary people assigned male at birth. And there's a whole kind of matrix. And you just think, can you not see LTA? Can you not see what you're doing here? You're doing everything to avoid simply dropping this gender identity stuff and restoring a policy based on sex. And underlying all that is a policy based on sex, but they seemingly can't let go. So, of course, there's a whole sort of glossary of terms as well. Most people who play tennis will not know what a cisgender woman is.
Yeah.
And frankly, those who do are mainly insulted by it.
Yeah.
So this is the long march back to sanity, but they still haven't let go of the ideology.
And when an organization like the Lawn Tennis Association, a classical English institution, is, awash with this kind of ideology, that in itself is quite a frightening prospect. I wanted to ask you about again on the media coverage. Do you think that's changing as well? There are some groups who are specifically challenging. I mean, there are all sorts of brilliant women's groups that have emerged over the past few years, yours being one of them, and there are many others too. But there's a Scene in Journalism, for example, which is really challenging the extraordinarily distorted language that is used to write about sport, to write about crimes, to write about all sorts of social affairs. Journalists are supposed to tell us the truth, but very often they lie simply with the words they use. What more can be done to challenge the way in which people cover it? I mean, would you rather that these outlets just said men rather than trans women? I mean, are we talking about that much of a shift is needed?
Well, I think we have to, because the polling shows that around a third of the population really can't keep hold of whether a trans woman or transgender woman, is a male who identifies as female or vice versa. So it becomes very confusing. And you are right. A lot of the coverage is sensationalist and says transgender people banned from sport. And you're totally right. No one is banned from sport. No one should be. It's their choice if they don't want to play in an open category, or in the case of tennis, in a male category if they're male. But even there are so many other opportunities. For example, with tennis, club leagues tend to be mixed anyway. And of course, what happens is the women end up broadly clustered at lower down in the league and the men broadly at the top. But yeah, the media seem to love to say trans people banned. But even when they say transgender women banned, that's confusing, because some people think that that's a woman who doesn't want to be known as a woman. And there's no reason why such a woman should be banned from female sport. As long as she's not using testosterone, she belongs. So it would be lovely if the media would just do their job and use the language that everyone understands, which is a man who identifies as a woman, or a man who says he's trans or is transgender, if they want to go that far. I mean, I don't know what that means really, but so yeah, they're not really serving the population well. But when we poll people, everybody agrees. Well, maybe, 85% of people agree that when it comes to sport, women and girls do need a separate category in sport that's gender affected, which is almost all of it. And identity doesn't come into it. So the public is with us, even if the media is not necessarily always helping them understand what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the point you made earlier about non-professional sports is such an important one, because people tend to forget that this, we hear about the big stories when a bloke goes into the women's weightlifting or women's foot or women's tennis or whatever else it might be, but we don't hear about the, millions of girls and young women who play sport unprofessionally and who don't want men in their sports. You mentioned the IOC. I did want to ask you about Imane Khelif, the Algerian boxer. I'm not entirely sure what we're allowed to say about Imane Khelif. We don't want this video to be taken down from YouTube. And there's still a risk of that these days, even though things are shifting. But that, of course, was at the Paris Olympics. It was a bit of an eye-opener for lots of people, even people who aren't particularly familiar with this controversy or this issue. A lot of people were shocked that this person was punching women, and J.K. Rowling led the charge and made lots of comments about it. How do you understand Imane Khelif? How do you see that particular problem?
My understanding is that Khelif is a male athlete with a disorder of sex development, which means that his external genitalia may not have developed properly when he was a baby or in utero, and he may have been incorrectly registered as female at birth, but it will have become very obvious very quickly that he was male. This is the Semenya story. And in the case of Semenya, that's kind of official now because the Court of Arbitration for Sport has referred to 46XY, 5ARD, that's his condition, male chromosomes, but with this developmental error, if you like, so that his external genitalia didn't come out quite right, but it's got internal testes, his body responds to that, develops as a male. And coming back to Khelif, and indeed others like Khelif, if a young athlete, a female athlete, does not get a period, that is a medical concern. And if you get to 15 or 16, and particularly if you're in some kind of talent pathway where you're training hard, people will worry that you're training too hard because women need a certain amount of body fat in order for the normal processes, fertility processes to happen. So menstruation stopping or never starting is a bad sign. So there's really no chance that someone who has got to an elite level without ever having a period because he's male has not been detected. I believe that must have been the case with Semenya, and that is why sex screening before they get to the Olympics would be the sensible thing. If the objection to sex screening is it's humiliating, it's terrible, it ruins their lives, well, don't let it go that far because it's already ruined other people's lives because the women have lost their opportunities, in the national team, all the way through when that male is coming through the talent pathway. So that's our understanding of Khelif. Sex screening would have solved that, and we understand that he's failed sex screening a couple of times.
It's good that the IOC has come to its senses, and the LA Olympics will be fair in the sense that sex screening will take place. But do you think there will ever be a reckoning with what happened over the past decade and more in terms of lost opportunities for women, the sacrifice of women's sporting opportunities at the altar of ideology, I guess, or a fad, a crazy fad that overtook so many institutions? Do you think there'll be a reckoning with that? Sharon Davis, for example, often talks about the fact that she lost out so many opportunities to Eastern European female swimmers who were on synthetic testosterone, and she makes it clear she's got a lot of sympathy for those women because they were very often forced onto these drugs by their male trainers. She lost opportunities to, I guess, fake testosterone, and then modern day women lose opportunities to real testosterone when men are allowed to compete against them. Do you think we'll ever have a proper accounting of how that happened, why it happened, how we can prevent it from happening again?
Sadly, I do not think so. I mean, the Rio 800 meters podium, the Olympic Games in 2016, when 3 men took the 3 medals in the women's event. Everyone knows that. Yeah. And, we even know who to give the medals to because they all ran in the same race. And no, there's no reckoning for that. Those were DSD athletes, obviously led by Semenya. But the problem is that those were the rules at the time. And the IOC in 2024 actually ran the boxing. Because they'd fallen out with the previous World Boxing Authority, they ran the boxing in Paris. They authorized Khelif to box. And so, no, there will be no reckoning. And then the net effect of all of that is lots of collateral damage to lots of women, but also really a discrediting of the IOC for its weakness, for its pandering, and ultimately for what some might say is, a dishonest approach because they always knew the difference between men and women. It wasn't until 1984 that women were allowed to run the Olympic marathon. And no one ever said, well, we can't tell which ones are the men and which ones are the women. We'll just let them run. So it has undermined people's trust and confidence. And you sort of watch some of that stuff and think, what am I really watching here? Am I really watching the excellence of the human body, or has this been engineered in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. Or am I watching people cheating against women? Yeah. I wanted to ask you about a couple of broader social issues before I let you go. So one of the big stories is that the EHRC's code for reminding us that men are men and women are women, and what that means for public institutions, that has come into force. It's caused quite a bit of controversy, perhaps not as much as it would have caused maybe 3 or 4 years ago at the high point of some of the trans ideology, but certainly there is pushback. There are local councils who are saying, look, we're not going to stop people from using the changing rooms that they feel most comfortable in, or the toilets they feel most comfortable in. So some institutions are openly saying they will defy this code, which says that intimate areas should be accessed according to biological sex rather than gender identity. What have you made of that? People are saying it's unworkable, and in a sense they might be right, because there are so many people who are willing to barge into the areas where they're not welcome. How do you see that panning out?
Well, the law, of course, was already clear, and the code is just meant to help people understand the law and apply it to their particular situation. So responsible organisations are already doing the right thing. And, you know, after the Supreme Court judgment in the case of Women's Scotland, we had lots of sports bodies change their policies. We had some employers change their policies, even though the judgment didn't affect the workplace regulations. Those were already clear. But so we're seeing a gradual trickle. I'd like it to be more of a cascade, but we are seeing change. So we've got these councils that you mention, somewhat performatively declaring that they're not going to police their facilities and it can't be done. At least 2 of them are already facing legal challenges from women. It is clear that no one's asking them to police, as you say. This all depends on people doing the right thing. Yep. It's a bit like speeding. You know, we have speeding laws and some people break it, but we don't say, oh, well, then we should abandon those laws, or those laws are unworkable. We just try and make it work. I think in time, those councils will fall into line, because it's too expensive to keep defying the law. And the law is perfectly clear. It's perfectly workable. We all know what sex we are. We all just have to do the right thing. I'd like to think that people will start to have a little more confidence if they work in a council, or if they are in a council facility, to just say, you know, I'd like the facilities to be single sex. They are bad single sex. You know, can we just make sure that's what we get? But we know that people still can lose their job, or in the case of the user of a Southwark leisure centre, be banned from the facility for daring to say that. So we have a way to go, but I still think the momentum is very much in our favour.
One argument we hear quite a lot in relation to this issue, we hear it from, you know, ostensibly even quite sensible commentators and observers. They will say, you know, what about the person who's been through some drastic bodily changes? So, for example, the man who has had a lot of surgery, who has maybe even had facial surgery, you know, the kind of thing I'm talking about, who's made a lot of effort to, in his view, look like a woman. They will often say, you know, it's ridiculous to expect people like this to use the male facilities. And sometimes they'll even say they might get harassed in the male facilities. And it always makes me laugh that they think it's terrible for a man to use a man's facilities, but fine for a man to use a woman's. How do you respond to that, I guess, to that bind that some people have put themselves in by radically transforming themselves in the expectation that they could go wherever they please, and now they find out they can't?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The real problem there is that some people, a promise has been made, if you like, to people that cannot be fulfilled. Yeah. Because that was a promise that all of us would give up our single-sex privacy where it matters to us, so that those men in particular could have what they wanted. So that's tough. That's going to take a while for them to get used to. No one is saying that men must use male facilities. We're only saying men can't go into women's facilities.
Yeah.
And the problem with the example, which as you say is often brought up, is first of all, who arbitrates what level of transition or commitment or genuineness is sufficient? Because, women are much more sensitized to hear a male voice or see a male gait, spot a male body than men are. So we're far more likely to detect that there's a man. But even if that man thinks he can get away with it, what gives him the right to put his desires ahead of the needs of women? So there isn't a point where you can say that man has transitioned enough, because quite honestly, I really don't want to see anyone's genital area to find out what's there or not. I mean, that's not how things work. And that model, that framing is basically about saying some people are so genuine, so committed that they really ought to be rewarded with kind of recognition. Well, that's not what public spaces are for.
Yeah.
They're not for validation of people's identities. Those people should be safe. But if they don't feel safe in a men's facility, that's a bad thing. That's why we want single-sex facilities. We don't feel safe in men's facilities either.
Yeah.
And so we have plenty of gender-neutral facilities, but it's not a license to go into women's spaces, because if you grant that license to somebody, you're granting it to all the bad actors, as well as to anyone that someone might feel is truly, genuinely deserving of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so striking that a lot of these trans activists are incredibly reluctant to use a gender neutral space precisely for the reasons you say, which is what they're seeking is validation. And the minute that women say you're not allowed in here, it's calling into question their entire, I would say, delusional identity, and they see that as an intolerable thing. I did want to ask you about the puberty blocker trial. It's, as a layperson who observes this stuff quite closely, but not as closely as you, it's difficult to work out exactly what's going on here. I know it was paused. The trial was paused previously. I think it's now coming back at some point. They've set the age now. I think the kids have to be at least 11 years old to take part in this trial. It has, of course, caused a huge controversy. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who thought that the puberty blocker issue had been put to rest and we'd come to our senses and decided that it would only be used in extreme medical situations like precocious puberty or where it's really needed. But it seems to still be floating around as a prospect. Where do things stand with puberty blockers, and where do you think they might go next?
Well, you're right to say the trial is back on. Small concessions were made, nothing meaningful, because by definition, you cannot, for example, offer fertility protection or future-proofing of fertility to a young person who is then going to have their puberty blocked.
Yeah.
If you're blocking their puberty, that means their body's not matured enough for any sperm extraction or egg extraction or anything like that. So it is still going to be as disastrous for those young people as the original design of the trial. The argument seems to be that, this is the argument Hilary Cass makes, Baroness Cass, who wrote the review, and who wrote in that review that no one can tell which children might benefit, and no one can really tell, and clearly it does more harm than good for a lot of young people. Her argument seems to be that there's so much demand and commitment to puberty blockers from parents who believe, and children who believe that's what they need, that a trial will somehow help address that. But the way this trial has been designed will not do that, because all you're doing is confirming that puberty blockers could be a treatment, and still there's no basis to know which children. I would say no child benefits from having their puberty blocked unless they're in precocious puberty. And even then, there are significant side effects, but it's arguably a trade-off worth making. So the thing is due to go ahead. They have said that I believe they're starting to recruit children, but that they will not start applying puberty blockers until something like November. The legal challenge failed because the judges basically said, this is a medical trial, and, it's a very high bar for judges to say, we're going to overrule the medics. There's £10 million riding on this for the people running the trial. It's a big academic study. The one thing I would say that is still completely extraordinary for all of us, and I don't understand why Baroness Cass hasn't made more of this, is the the analysis of the medical records of all the young people who've already had their puberty blocked in the UK has still not happened. And there are estimated to be 2,000 of those over something like an 8-10 year period at the Gender Identity Clinic in London. And that was supposed to happen as part of the CAS review. The adult gender clinics refused to cooperate, and it seems like they're still refusing to cooperate. So I think it's a tragedy for those children. One final thing to say about that. Again, Hilary Cass has said that she thinks the trial is important because otherwise people will go and obtain these drugs on the street, as it were, unlawfully. They'll self-medicate, they'll buy privately, and this is better than that. Well, that is what is known as a harm reduction model. It is not, this trial is not a harm reduction model because by definition, children who are already getting any kind of medication can't join the trial. So, the experts say, no, if you want a harm reduction approach, this isn't how you do it. That's not what you're doing. Don't give us that. The real story here is, there's no benefit to these things. The activists are bending your ear on it. We really should be blocking that false narrative instead of feeding it by running a trial.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary that they're running a trial when, as you say, there are lots of kids in this country who we could examine or look into or ask questions of who've already been put on these puberty blocking pathways. That is almost surreal. Okay, Fiona, my last question for you is just, we've talked a lot about momentum, things moving around, positive shifts that are taking place and not so positive shifts. I wanted to get a sense from you of where you think the land lies more broadly in relation to the trans question. I often think about how insane things were maybe 6-7 years ago, especially around 2020, when the whole world seemed to go insane on lots of issues to do with race, gender, wokeness, as some of us called it. A lot of that stuff seems to be dissipating, seems to be fading out. We've just heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez say that woke one was crazy, which I think is her way of saying wokeness in its first origins was mad.
I have a local city councilman that has this saying, woke one was crazy.
Woke one was crazy.
Might also be her indicating that she's about to run for presidency. Where do you think things lie in relation to the trans question? We've got a couple of sensible political leaders now. Kemi Badenoch is saying brilliant things on this question and other issues. Do you think the world is coming to its senses, or is there still a lot of work for people like you to do?
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize how mad it got and still don't really have much awareness. We all live in our own bubbles, and I still meet people who don't really, who will still say, well, there are some real trans people and they need special accommodations, but, not in sport. They'll say something like that. So I think there's still a lot of a widespread belief that some people have this kind of psychological need to present as the other sex, and that the kind thing to do is to accommodate it. And they haven't thought through the impact of that on other people. But fortunately, at a policy level and a political level, I think there is so much understanding now that this is really not a vote winner. Promoting trans inclusion and so on really isn't a vote winner in most cases. And that is what I think is going to help us carry the day and get back to sensible policies. And just to be clear, of course, people who want to present as the other sex should have the sort of sensible accommodations that help them live an acceptable life, just as you would say for anyone who has a medical need or a psychological need. But the rest of us can't be conscripted to help deliver that, and certainly not at the expense of our own needs. And the politicians would love not to talk about this anymore, but they can't. We will not let them avoid this subject until we get the policies not just in place and on the statute, but enacted with proper compliance.
Fiona, thank you very much.
Thank you.